Okay. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate it. Again, I know this is dinner time. If you don't know who I am, my name is Kat Maynard. I am the home finder for the Jamestown office for GA. Um, we are going to be discussing tonight generational trauma, and some of you may or may not be familiar with this. It is a topic that I've always found interesting. It's still very new and young and being developed and researched. But I'm going to present what we have, like what society has discovered and what we're still learning. So if you do have any questions, please throw them in the chat. We also have time at the end to have a discussion. Um, and I always want other people's thoughts and definitely have questions if you have those out there, because you may have something that someone else may not share. So it's always good to do that. So let's get started. So as you guys know, I mean, we are in foster care. We deal with trauma. We hear about trauma all the time. But just to always have a review, trauma is a pervasive problem. It results from exposure to an incident or a series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. As we know, we do have kiddos that come into our care that are struggling with trauma, that do have a history. And so we're going to learn a little bit more about how that history, not just of their own experiences, but that of their family, their ancestors, and how that affects them today. Um, so this is a quote I really like. We don't just inherit our skin tone, the color of our eyes, or the broadness of our shoulders from our parents. We can also inherit our family's story, narrative, and views about life within our family tree. We may represent the green, budding leaves, but the very branches that pulsate life into us are grounded in our ancestors' deeply embedded roots. So again, we may get these little pieces of our family. We may look like our dad, our mom, have different characteristics, but there's so much more underneath that comes from our ancestors. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is. So if I could talk, generational trauma is exactly what it sounds like. So this is trauma that isn't just experienced by one person, but extends from generation to the next. So if you're thinking, the big ones we always kind of bring up is the Holocaust. If we're talking about wars, we are talking about genocide, famine, families or communities that have been displaced, slavery. So these are just some small examples of what generational trauma is in the history that we've experienced. So how did this all start? How did the generational trauma conversation even begin? This was first observed in 1966 by clinicians alarmed by the number of children of survivors of the Holocaust seeking treatment in Canada. The researcher, and I do apologize for forgetting his name, he realized the children of survivors of the Holocaust were coming in with very high anxiety, struggling with depression, often with having experienced abuse or domestic violence in their home, even struggling with substances themselves. And what they realized is that their ancestors or their parents, because they didn't get the treatment, because very mental health was not really known when the Holocaust was occurring, when World War II had ended. You really didn't talk about your feelings, and so people were very guarded. However, that barrier, those walls they had put up, had caused so much more in the PTSD that happened. If you think about vets coming back and they're struggling with kind of getting back into society norms, the same thing was happening with these survivors. And so they were drinking more, they were having more violent outbursts. And this was something their children had experienced, who are now displaying these behaviors and passing this on to their children. And the interesting piece for this specific research is that it was expanding not just at 1966, but continued throughout the years. So they then checked on the survivors' children's children in the 80s, and then so on and so forth. And they've actually gone back in 2017 and did a questionnaire for the children of survivors. And there was still a high percentage of them that were still struggling with anxiety, with depression. Um, and so sometimes some of those things had not been worked on. They weren't seeking treatment still, and so they still had these remnants of the trauma they had experienced or their parents had experienced. So this is where it all kind of started. And again, this is still very young, as it sees 1960s. It's still very young and still being researched. So how this kind of looks, if you kind of were to lay it out. So you have a first generation, which is the grandparents. So they could have experienced war, which leads to PTSD, maybe that leads to alcoholism, domestic violence, so on and so forth. These are just examples. So then they pass that on to the second generation, the parents. The parents are then dealing with that physical and emotional abuse, their regressed anger, untreated mental illness, and alcoholism. And then if you look at to their children, the third generation, they're now dealing with depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, and self-destructive behaviors. And this is all stemming from the first generation not getting treatment, or not getting the right help or support. And again, what we're seeing is um, when the first generation was dealing with these traumatic incidents or historical events, or even just simple things such as a car accident, a house fire, traumatic events that really changed their life. And they didn't get that treatment because maybe it was taboo, or maybe, they were always taught you kind of just deal with it, you dig in, you just deal with it. And these feelings, these emotions are impacting how they're parenting, how they're treating others, how they are taking care of themselves, which then goes on to the next generation and the next generation. So how can this be passed down? So we have this lovely word called epigenetics. I love saying it. It's a fun word to say. So we have epigenetics and behavior. So what's less clear is how this trauma is actually transmitted from one generation to the next. It's, like I said, it's still being developed. Trauma itself can contribute to poverty, compromised parenting, diminished attachment, chronic stress, unstable living environments, which then can directly impact children and their development, which is what we are seeing in foster care. We are seeing these children who have been impacted due to this intergenerational or generational trauma that's been passed down. So epigenetics itself literally means above the gene. And so what it's suggesting is that our genes can carry memories of trauma experienced by our ancestors and can influence how we react to trauma and stress. Now, they're stating that the actual DNA itself isn't changing, nothing's being removed, it's not looking different. What is happening is it's acting different. So it is now having switches. So it is now being the stress response, the fear response are being triggered at certain situations, and they're still learning about how they're being turned on and off, and it's releasing that stress hormone and putting us in the flight, fight, freeze response. And so that's what the epigenetics piece is. Another example of this is if you think back for, women, when we're carrying our child, not only are we carrying our child, but our children are, if it's a female, are carrying their eggs as well. So they're born with their eggs for their child. So we're kind of carrying our grandchild. And so if we are dealing with a stressful situation, if we're going through a traumatic incident, we're then passing that and that through the DNA to our children. I always use my example is my grandmother. She had a lot of trauma. She dealt with a lot of changes in her life, and she was carrying my mother. My mother is a very anxious person, struggled with mental health herself. And then with me, I have generalized anxiety disorder and depression. And so I'm being mindful now because my mom didn't really have those tools to understand the mental health piece. And so now me, being a social worker and being in this field, I have to be very mindful that I possibly could have passed um, these things to my children, to my daughters. And so knowing that this is something that could have been passed down to me, something that I'm dealing with, I'm now aware that if my children come up to me and they're struggling, that this is something I need to take care of, and hopefully help them healing them. But this is just a really interesting case of how, you know, it can be traced back to our grandparents. Any questions so far? Okay. So another example of this, and I really enjoy this, is, and I apologize, it's kind of shocking. 2013 is a cherry blossom experiment. I have a short video. I think it does a much better, gives a much better explanation of the experiment itself, and it has a really neat kind of narrative and cartoon. So I will show that to you. Pat, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear it?
The sweet smell of fruit doesn't normally send rats running. But when researchers paired the orange cherry almondy scent of the chemical acetophenone with a painful electric shock, lab rats quickly learned to fear it. Along the way, extra neurons sprouted in their noses and in the smell processing center of their brains, making them super sensitive to the scent. This result isn't shocking. What is surprising is that the rats' pups and their pups' pups were also startled by the smell of acetophenone and had the same extra neurons as their fathers, despite never having been introduced to either their dads or the fruity scent before. But how could the pups have inherited something that their fathers learned? Basic genetics tells us that only DNA gets passed along to offspring. Characteristics like memories, scars, or giant muscles can't get passed on since acquiring them doesn't alter the genetic code. But it turns out that instilling fear in the rats did trigger genetic changes, not in the DNA sequence itself, but instead in how that code was read and used in the rats' bodies. In every cell, biological machinery constantly translates DNA into the proteins needed to carry out vital processes. Chemical switches attached to the DNA turn genes on or off or up and down, telling the machinery which proteins to produce and in what quantities. These switches, called epigenetic tags, are why a kidney cell looks and acts differently than a skin or nerve cell, even though all three cells have identical DNA. But the switches in any one cell aren't set in stone. Teaching those rats to fear the fruity smell switched one of their smell-sensing genes into overdrive. Researchers don't know all the places in the rats' bodies where this switch got flipped, but they know it happened in one key set of cells, the rat's sperm cells, which would one day pass along the tweaked genetic material, making the next generation of rats super sensitive to acetophenone. Rodents aren't the only creatures demonstrating this weird type of inheritance. In Ivakalik, Sweden, boys who suffered through tough winter famines went on to have super healthy sons, with extremely low rates of heart disease and diabetes. And their sons had the same excellent health, living an unbelievable 32 years longer on average than the grandsons of boys who hadn't gone hungry. To be clear, this does not mean that we should start starving our kids for the benefit of future generations. Scientists don't even know yet exactly which switches the Swedish famines flipped. While we have been able to connect specific epigenetic changes to health effects in mice, we're a long way off from being able to make those connections in humans. That may sound like a bummer, but it's mostly because we humans don't live in the well-controlled environment of a laboratory. And for that, we should be grateful.
Okay. So I always find that experiment really interesting just because, you know, if you think of it as kind of a human part of it, some of our kids, maybe have not met their grandparents, but may be affected by things that have been passed along through that DNA, that genetics. Um, so, so what are these potential effects of that generational trauma? Hold on one second. There we go. First generation is that PTSD. What we're seeing is the first generation is just not dealing with that trauma, the situation that had occurred. Again, it could be something quite catastrophic as war, it could be the genocide, it could be displacement, it could be those bigger, much bigger things, or it could be these things such as all of a sudden your house is on fire, or you're losing your job and there's homelessness. Maybe there is you're spiraling into substance abuse, or a car accident, something of that nature that could be a little bit smaller, but still having that effect where it is traumatic and is life changing. So again, first generation oftentimes is not seeking the help or not able to get the help to really process through and to deal with it. So the subsequent generations are going to be looking like they're going to be dealing with a lot of guilt, depression, anger, thoughts of suicide, nightmares, preoccupation with that trauma or that traumatic event, difficulties with relationships, difficulty with expressing emotions, physical symptoms, diabetes, heart disease, and other diseases associated with high stress hormones. So in my research, I was reading about how children of survivors of the Holocaust and what that situation was looking like. So if their parent, again, was not talking about it, not talking about what they went through, and were often putting up that wall. They weren't really expressing emotions. And so with their children learned not to really express those emotions, to kind of keep those things hidden. And maybe they're having that they're not attaching to people because their parents were not able to attach to them because of their trauma. Some of these things, and it's not just the genetic piece, but behavioral piece, and I'll go into that soon, is it could be through storytelling. If we had our great grandparents or our grandparents telling us certain information about what they've experienced, we may take that on, and we may take on that trauma. And when we're constantly hearing about it, and it's something that's discussed often, we take on those emotions because we see how upset they are. So we can start becoming affected. And it's kind of very similar to, of course, my brain just forgot about it, but like when we are working with our youth and they are dealing with their own traumatic events and we're taking that on, we're carrying that weight. It's very similar to that. So this next example I have is based on the Aboriginals. And I think that's important because we can kind of compare it very similarly to what Native Americans dealt with here and continue to struggle with. When our Native Americans, the First Nations, were removed from their home, their children were removed, placed in schools, boarding homes, their hair was cut, their traditions were lost. Their identity was taken away from them. So it's something that we see close to us as well. But I think it's a good video that kind of wraps that up. So I will show that to you.
The story of our communities, people and nation starts a long, long time ago. More than 60,000 years, in fact. This was when our culture and our law first started to thrive. We knew who we were and where we belonged. We took care of each other, our land and our waters. We ate food that made us healthy, lived on country and abided by our laws and song lines. Our families, our children were happy, with strong minds and hearts, because they were where they belonged. But then, everything changed.
Colonization came, bringing wars, disease, famine, violence, and the destruction and violation of our cultural laws, sacred sites, families, and communities.
We were denied our knowledge, language, ceremonies, and identity, the very things that tell us who we are and where we belong. and our connections with each other and the land grew weak.
And then our children were taken from us. They had their names changed and their identities stripped away. They were told that Aboriginal people were bad. Worse still, they were told that their parents and grandparents did not want them.
For years this happened, and those children became known as the Stolen Generations.
Our children were denied love and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This left very deep, very complex, and very real wounds, leaving scars that are still being felt personally, socially, spiritually, and collectively.
In the time when our story started, we were able to parent in the cultural way that has seen our families survive and thrive for generations. Our people were strong, and our culture flowed and healed us in times of hurt.
But since the trauma of colonisation and the stolen generations, we have not been able to heal in the same way. And we have unknowingly passed this trauma on to our children through sharing our sad stories and having them witness and experience our pain. This is known as intergenerational trauma, and we see symptoms today in broken relationships, disconnected families, violence, suicide, and drug and alcohol abuse.
But this is not where our story ends. We still have strong minds and hearts, and we still know who we were and where we belong. By creating safe and strong communities together, supporting our families to be free from pain, returning to our culture and building a strength of identity, we can stop the cycle of trauma and bring about positive intergenerational change, so that we can continue to thrive for the next 60,000 years. There are simple things that we can all do to help heal our trauma.
Visit healingfoundation.org.au to find out more.
Okay, thank you for watching that. I really like that little video. I think it gives a good perspective on how when you take families away, communities away, and you displace them and you tried to change them, and how it now, the repercussions we see today from that. So another example of the generational trauma is one that I read in What Has Happened to You, which is a book I really appreciate and like. It's in the end of this PowerPoint. But Oprah Winfrey gives a really nice example about how she experienced or took on trauma. So as a young girl, she was pretty much raised by her grandmother. And oftentimes they'd be walking in the neighborhood, and anytime her grandmother came upon a dog or heard a dog barking and she was holding Oprah's hand, she would start to get really tense and very stressed and uncomfortable. And what Oprah didn't realize that she was experiencing and taking on her grandma's reaction to this dogs. So if you know Oprah, you know that she actually has dogs now, but growing up, she had this fear of animals and specifically dogs, because every time her grandmother would see one or hear one, she gave a physical reaction. And we talk about the DNA part, but it's the behavior part that also plays a role. In that video, they talked about how sharing stories, sharing their experiences and their pain, and that being taken on, that is really important to understand, because it's behaviors that can also play a role in that trauma. So, playing on the Oprah story is, if we look back at when slavery was occurring, right? So when a slave was to try to escape and run away, owners would often use dogs to track them. So maybe someone's great grandmother had experienced this, and so that's the start of that trauma. Now, if you look again during civil rights movements, when there was protest, when there was marches, dogs were used to keep people in line, quote unquote. And so you see those images. So if your grandmother or mother had experienced that, that could be something, again, passed on. And so now Oprah, or if a woman today was to have that fear, this could be why. It could be that her family has had history over history of having these negative experiences with an animal. And this is just a very small piece of it, and a small example. But I think it really shows how profound it could be and be passed on behaviorally, and not just genetic wise. And it's just history shows all this. History shows that dogs were used in slavery, dogs were used during the civil rights movement. So if there's an interaction with a dog now, it could be very uncomfortable and unsettling because again, that switches on, and that's that fear, that stress hormone is being released. Okay. So another example, and I'm not going to show the video for this, but I highly recommend to watch Encanto if you have not seen it yet. I do apologize. The Bruno song is very contagious. I could listen to it over and over again. It's a beautifully well-made film honestly, about generational trauma, about how the abuela had to face this adversity, to face pain, and she wanted to protect her family so much. She put so much pressure on them that the foundation started to crack and really started to affect everybody. And it's well made, like I said. And if I know I don't mind giving training hours for it, and I'm sure Pat wouldn't mind if you watch the video and you write a quick summary. But I really think it's a powerful film, and it opens doors to have conversations with our children, with our foster youth that are coming into our home that maybe have experienced, their grandparents may have experienced something. So it's a great film. It's just one that we recommend. So how does this relate to parenting? So it's important to know how your history can impact you right now. So how you parent plays a key role in how your children start to interpret the world. Children learn through observation, and as parents, we are constantly modeling, often unconsciously. I have a 2-year-old who's right now, she could be kind of like that mama bird. She is always watching what you're doing. She repeats what you're saying. And so just being mindful of how we are presenting ourselves and what we're doing. Are we being a positive role model? And so this kind of goes back into, do I have patterns that have been passed down that my children might be picking up as well? So what patterns am I carrying that were passed? And certain examples of this are anxiety, depression, history with substance abuse, difficulty with relationships, and social issues. So if, being mindful of, if I'm dealing with my anxiety, how am I presenting that in front of my daughter? How I feel about myself, I have to make sure I keep myself in check because she's taking that on through observation. And so with trauma, it's very similar. If we are constantly talking about this scenario, this traumatic event that occurred, how we're feeling about it, the pain that we're feeling about it, our children take that on, just like how we may take on our youth's trauma when they're telling us things. So just being mindful is so important when we're talking about looking back at our family's history. How does that affect me today? How is it changing how I'm parenting, how I'm reacting to when a child's escalating or yelling and having certain behaviors? How am I reacting to that because of what I've gone through or my family has gone through? That's really important to recognize. So generation trauma in foster care. Many of the problem behaviors seen regularly in our day-to-day lives through the child welfare system, from parental substance abuse, mental illness, harsh parenting practices, physical abuse, are either maladaptive strategies to deal with unaddressed abuse or dysfunctional parenting behaviors learned from an abusive home. Other parental stressors which contribute to abusive behavior like poverty, chronic unemployment, lack of education, and chronic homelessness can be traced back to family history. So oftentimes, we do have families of the youth that come into care, and we're thinking to ourselves, why don't they just get it together? Why can't they just do what they need to do? Why would they even get into this situation? Here's the answer. Oftentimes, the families that we have, the parents of the children that are coming into our homes, are dealing with their own generational trauma. I have seen quite an influx of parents that have come in that have gone through foster care themselves, that have been in residential treatment themselves, that have come from broken homes, deplorable conditions. Now, mind you, not everyone that has gone through that is going to have a child that comes into foster care. But if you do not have the tools, if you do not have the support system to work through it, to process, to heal, this is how it gets passed on. So when we're asking, why is this child acting this way? Why are their parents acting this way? We have to think that the children that we have today, those were their parents 20 years ago, 15, 30 years ago. And so their parents could have been the kids that we're looking at that come into foster care. So just to be mindful of when we're working with these families, and it can be frustrating and upsetting at times, we have to understand where they might be coming from. So what does this look like in our youth? So signs of dealing with unprocessed trauma are different for everyone, but these are some of the signs to look for that it could indicate that generational trauma is affecting our kids. So there could be that irritability, signs of anxiety or depression, disordered eating, troubled regulating emotions, self-harm, substance abuse, nightmares or insomnia, behavioral issues at school, lack of academic motivation, distrust of doctors or authority figures, and fear of asking for help. And again, these are some behaviors they have seen their parents exhibit, and their parents have seen their families exhibit. So it's being passed down, these behaviors, these reactions. So this is what it could look like in our youth. So breaking that chain of trauma. So these pieces kind of talk about how if it was us, but you can also correlate this to our youth. So we want to have that open conversation with our own parents if we're dealing with trauma, and generational trauma, about, what have you gone through? What have you experienced? How did you deal with it when you went through it? Notice any embedded patterns, attitudes, or narratives from your family that continue to portray. You want to talk through these areas with a friend, a family member, or a therapist, and consider alternative ways of coping or communicating. I've definitely had this discussion with my own father, who is a recovering alcoholic. And we kind of sat down and we discussed, like, where did this come from? Like, this addicting personality, the piece of his personality. And to come to find out, my grandfather really struggled and his grandfather really struggled. It was just kind of on my dad's side where the family just didn't have the best coping skills. So my father really learned that. And so it's up to me, and I know I could be very susceptible to substance abuse, just because it does run in the family, and it's been something I've always seen and been around, that I have to be able to maintain myself, that I have to be mindful if I'm having a beverage. What's my limit? Do I know how to stop this? Because I don't want to go down that road of alcoholism. So I have to be aware of, what's around me and my own vulnerabilities, I guess. So another piece of this is acknowledging that you do not understand their experience, but want to support them in understanding why they are the way they are. So no, all kids, teens will want to talk about this. So they're not always, we know these kids don't always have that kind of conversation. Sometimes they're not the most talkative and they're not going to always share. But I think letting them know and understanding that this is available to have that conversation with them, that you are a safe space. I do apologize if there's noise. It is my 1-year-old. There's also documentaries, and again, using that Encanto is really important. You can kind of use that as a leeway to have that conversation, and acknowledging your own family history, how it has impacted you and how it has impacted you as a person, and being a model for them. So being open, again, being knowledgeable of that child's age, but being open to, like, hey, this is something I've had to face when I was growing up. And that could lead to a conversation. And changing your lifestyle to support the life you want, that you want to live, not the lifestyle that you've been unconsciously given, is important. So this is a quote I really like. It's up to us to break the generational curse. When they say it runs in the family, you tell them this is where it runs out. So it really has to stop with us. And that's how we're teaching these children. We're learning, we're giving them tools and techniques to heal. Yes, I know my sorry, daughter's talking. So they don't have to continue that pattern that their parents have faced. So we want to make sure that we're getting them the right resources and services to assist them in this. So these are the two really great books that I always recommend regarding this topic. So It Didn't Start With You. I really found this really nicely informative. It talks about kind of the physical aspects of how trauma could be inherited and how it impacts us that way. And then What Has Happened to You is by Dr. Bruce Perry, he's my go-to guy. I have read almost all of his books and watched every video of his. But this is the one with Oprah, and just kind of going over, the quote, just what has happened to you, instead of using what is wrong with you, and really talking about trauma, child development, and that healing process. So those are the two resources I definitely would recommend to you. So on that note, does anyone have any questions or comments? Okay. Pat, would you like to add anything to this?
No, just that you can get What Happened to You free if you have a Kindle Unlimited membership. It is free, it's included as part of that.
Okay.
So,
Thank you. I always forget that one. And I listen to it on Audibles. That was my go-to for it because I enjoy. Bruce Perry has a very nice listening voice, and so does Oprah. So yes, this is a topic that is still, like I said, still fresh, still learning about it. But I think it's important to recognize when we are working with families of the youth in our homes that this could be part of why they struggle, why they have those difficult moments. And I think it kind of makes us, take a step back, and we have to put our feelings aside in order to work with them and to be in partnership with them. So I do appreciate, I am going to stop my video. If I know how.
It
Nope.
was very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone attending. This is a topic I'm definitely passionate about, and I love learning. I love teaching it. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and thank you for the kids. All right. Have a good night, guys.